Hey, it's John from the Commander's Brew. This is Tawnos Solemn Survivor from the new Brothers War Commander decks, those old border ones. Tawnos seemed like another artifact commander, right? Nah, we're going Spellslingers. I've got all the cards I'm going to talk about in a link below, and I did manage to fit in some of my all-time favorite cards, but more on that later. This was a really fun exploration. You know, it just goes to show if you dig a little bit deeper, you can find some really interesting brews. I'll show you how we got here. I'm not going to give you a deck. I'm going to teach you to deck. But first I got to do a little bit of business. I promise I'll be quick about it. Here's two ads, one fake, one real. Visit beautiful Phyrexia. Have a delicious brunch at one of our gorgeous bed and breakfasts in the fourth sphere of the 9 hells. After our vat priests get you nice and plump, take a steam creature pulled carriage ride around the boiling sea of glistening oil. And we've got a wonderful nightlife too. Our punishment sphere has the hottest nightclubs and a sky full of enormous diamond-studded grinder teeth. And maybe you'll catch a glimpse of the 8th sphere, which is a place of pure energy. Little is known of it, except that it's fun. Book your trip today. We've got a very special deal on one-way tickets. Our sale price is something low enough to convince you that this is too good of a deal to pass up, but not so low that you think this is a trick. See you soon. And here's the real ad from the Wizard's Tower. WizardTower.com. Besides being a great place to look at articles on Commander and other formats, it's a place where you can buy Magic singles. And if you're ordering from Canada, I've got a great deal for you. Use coupon code BREWBROTHERS to get 5% off your singles. Though that deal is for real. Now back to the show. So let's dig into Tawnos Solemn Survivor. Tawnos Solemn Survivor. 2 mana is nice and cheap, and being able to reanimate anything for 4 mana and a couple of tokens is nice. Then we can pay 2 to make a copy of any artifact token, which, whatever we reanimated, would have to be. That's how it works. So at first glance, we're going to want to sneak something disgusting into our graveyard and then bring it back for cheap. Then maybe make a couple of copies of it. And we just need a handful of tokens to kick things off. In a pinch, we could use one of the things we reanimated as the artifact token if we absolutely had to. The real power though comes from the copying ability. The reanimating is only sorcery speed, but the copy can be anytime we want. That means we get to copy these artifact tokens at instant speed. If there's any sort of enter the battlefield ability on them, we will be able to threaten that effect by just holding up 2 mana, even if the thing costs 7 to begin with, and some of them will cost 7. And we have access to any creature we want this way as long as we bring them back through the graveyard via the reanimation, because it turns them into artifact tokens. And while looking through creatures with ETB abilities, I found there's a lot of them in blue that return instants and sorceries from our graveyard to our hand. We're planning on doing a bit of mill anyway, but if we're thinking of going Spellslingers here, there's a lot of options for us. Archaeomancer is one of the poster childs for bringing back spells from the graveyard to our hand. Shipwreck Dowser, same thing, but we've got a prowess trigger, so this thing also gets bigger as we cast spells, making it a potential threat. And something like Scholar of the Ages is fantastic to make instant speed copies of because we get to bring 2 spells back. The value! And then of course there's Scholar of the Lost Trove, where we don't actually bring something back to our hand, but making a copy of this copies any spell from our graveyard and we cast it for free, or a giant artifact as well. We've got both in this deck. And then there's Torrential Gearhulk. The nice thing here is we can actually hold it up for flash with 6 mana on our turn before we've even got it into the graveyard. But those spells do get exiled though, for what that's worth. So naturally our opponents will hate what we have going on here. I mean, we are an Esper deck, so trolling our opponents is sort of part of our color identity. So here's some ways to protect ourselves. The beauty of going with spells here is that we can keep getting them back to our hand to reuse them. Tawnos is 2 to copy the creature that returns the spell, and then 1 or 2 more for something like a counterspell. Just a classic magic card that protects us from most of the things the game has to offer. And then there's stuff like Slip Out the Back. This is a variant on the 1 mana instant speed, protect my creature from whatever you're gonna do type of spell, but the difference here is that it actually protects from wraths. A lot of the ones that grant hexproof, and we could certainly run a ton of those, they don't stop against a lot of effects, but they're very good at one kind of thing. This covers everything. The only drawback here is that Tawnos is actually gone for a little while, so we don't get to copy things. But I guess that's better than not having him because he got destroyed, except for Blacksmith's Skill. This one actually gives the creature hexproof and also indestructible, and if it somehow happens to be an artifact creature, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. And we will have a lot of those, so that might come up. And we're definitely going to run a few of these, so even if our opponents know that one's in our hand because we brought it back with one of those other creatures, they don't know that we don't have another one. So since the power of Tawnos really lies on that copying ability, let's go ham there. I'm talking untappers. Why should we only do that once per turn? Having a permanent that can untap Tawnos more than once is great, but if we're going to go Spellslinger, we might as well go with the spell versions to do this. and we can keep returning them to our hand. Twiddle, classic. Just 1 mana to tap or untap something. We're going to be untapping something. I think Chain Stasis is neat too. It really just taps or untaps something. But if we target our own stuff, we are that creature's controller, so we may pay 2 and a blue to copy the spell and pick a new target. I'm not planning on doing this on my opponent's stuff, so I don't think that's a drawback. Plus it's a reserve list card, and we can get it for $2. That's kind of neat, right? But also abolish the reserve list. Dream's Grip. Another way to do it for 1 mana, but then something like 1,000-Year Elixir is what I was referring to earlier. Plus the bonus here is what we get to use Tawnos' ability to reanimate and copy right away as long as we can untap him. And then 1,000-Year Elixir is an artifact, so it goes very nicely with Clock of Omens. Right, because we are planning on having a bunch of artifact tokens. That's kind of the whole thing we need to get this going, and I haven't gotten to that part yet. So this is the fuel that starts it all off. We need 2 artifact tokens to get the first reanimation going. And from there, we're golden. And for my money, I want cards that are the full package. Cards that are good as reanimator targets, but they also bring in artifact tokens that we can use for more reanimation. This is the beef. Any one of these cards could fuel a few reanimates, and if we can copy them, all the better. Mere Battlesphere, all-time classic for this sort of thing. We get 4 token artifacts along with it. That's 2 reanimates if we want. Plus this thing attacks big. And if we copy it, we get even more Mere, and we can just give one of them a ton of extra power. That makes that X damage pretty significant. I like Phyrexian Triniform. We probably won't be going for the Encore ability because, well, we plan on exiling this from our graveyard with Tawnos, not with its own ability. But when it dies, and tokens do die, they get eliminated as a state-based action, but the game does see them go to the graveyard, so we will get 3 colorless Golem artifact creature tokens every time one of these copies dies. Same thing with Triplicate Titan. These golems are fancier. And since we are planning on attacking with a lot of artifacts, I think Sharding Sphinx makes sense. And I still can't talk about this card without thinking of what it sounds like I'm saying. Sharding Sphinx? Anyway, this thing can make a boatload of Thopters, especially once we start swinging with a bunch of Thopters. It just kind of goes exponential. And then Metallurgic Summonings is the perfect thing to make artifact creature tokens in a Spellslinger deck. I'm not planning on these little constructs being much bigger than a 1 or 2 mana thing, but we'll have a ton of them, and that's all they're there for, to help us reanimate other things. And not to mention, we can pay 5 to get all those cards back to our hand. Only if you control 6 or more artifacts though. Shouldn't be a problem. I realize that in blue we've got a ton of options for other things that make creature tokens as we cast spells, but this is the only one that does artifacts. I don't really care about Drake so much. The token type. I do enjoy the Musician. And here's a segment on some removal. We've got some really powerful options from a reanimator standpoint. And again, if we can even copy these just once, the value is incredible. I really love value. Once our graveyard starts to get a little bit full, we'll have a lot of options, and it's always nice to have a few things to deal with problem permanents. Noxious Gear Hulk, fantastic way to deal with a creature plus gain a little bit of life. And along with Angel of Despair, they both attack pretty well. One's got Menace and this one's got Flying. And the Angel of Despair can destroy target permanent. That includes lands. Once we are able to copy Angel of Despair, we can just start mowing anything down. Same with Spine of Ishsa. Unfortunately, once we start to reanimate this with Tawnos, it'll be exiled, so we'll never be able to return the copy to our hand. But if we can get 1 token copy on the battlefield and copied a couple of times, I'd say it's done its job. And any of the Primordials are awesome. I can never understand why these cards are like $1/4 each. It's the same price as the Gumball. Luminant Primordial gets to exile 3 creatures, 1 for each opponent. Yeah, they gain a bit of life, but who cares? Diluvian Primordial, now we're casting 3 spells from our opponent's graveyards. Sepulchral Primordial has us just stealing their creatures out of their graveyards and using them against them. And the copy potential on any one of these 3 is incredible. And at this point, I think I should mention something like Smothering Tithe. It's just fantastic in any deck that can run it, but here we're also getting extra artifact tokens. And its other super expensive enchantment buddy, Anointed Procession. We're planning on making a lot of tokens, some of them with very powerful abilities, so naturally, doubling them again is fantastic. And if you are a millionaire and have access to these, might I direct you to patreon.com/commandersbrew for a quick moment? So this is my favorite part right here. While I was digging through the Spellslinger options, I realized there is significant overlap between a Spellslinger strategy and big artifacts. And that overlap is proliferating. The artifacts bring in the charge counters and the spells keep proliferating them over and over and over. And Flux Channeler is the perfect example for this. It's a creature, so Tawnos can reanimate this to get that going. We can potentially make copies of this so that whenever we're casting non-creature spells, we're proliferating twice or 3 times or even more. Although we are a Spellslinger deck, this thing also does non-creature spells. We will be casting artifacts from time to time the hard way, so that's a bonus. Same thing with Inexorable Tide. This one doesn't care what we cast, we're proliferating a lot. And the beauty of something like Contagion Engine is that if we're able to bring this back from the graveyard, we put that -1/-1 counter on the opponent's teams. And yes, of course, proliferating twice is amazing when they have those counters, but also just copying Contagion Engine for 2 puts more counters on things. That's a nice way to get extra counters on other people's creatures. When we first cast this, we only get the -1/-1s on one target opponent. And then Throne of Geth. We are planning on having a bunch of artifact tokens lying around, so being able to just sacrifice one of them for free, just a tap to proliferate, is fantastic. Now let's talk about some win cons, like Sphinx Bone Wand. We're casting spells, we're getting charge counters on them, we're proliferating those charge counters. It doesn't take too many charge counters before the next spell is potentially lethal. 8 damage, 9 damage, 10 damage. Those counters don't go away. I mean, they can, but only if our opponents do something about it. Depending on your style, maybe Magistrate Scepter is some way you want to go. We do have to pay to put that first charge counter on it, but being able to copy this a couple of times and add counters through proliferating means we should have infinite turns. Again, some tables really hate this kind of thing, but if they're cool with it, I'm cool with it. And then of course, Deep Glow Skate. Ooh, this card's incredible. It's cheap too because they've reprinted it a bunch of times. Wizards thinks. We're going to double all of our charge counters. It's going to be awesome. But imagine if this was in our graveyard. We pay the 4 from Tawnos to reanimate it. That's a double. And then just right away, if we can untap Tawnos, we'll copy it once for 2 more mana. That's a total of 6 mana to double our counters and then double it again. That's got to mean that the next spell we cast is going to eliminate a player with Sphinx Bone Wand, right? I'm putting the ramp here as my second last segment before I get to my favorite cards. And I put ramp near the end here because we're going to use charge counters to get a ton of ramp because of our proliferating. It's a great example how once you've got a little bit of a deck strategy going, that kind of informs the other choices. It only makes sense to run this kind of ramp. And quite frankly, we can put green decks to shame. It's not hard to get to the point where spending any mana to proliferate ends up making us mana back with the charge counters we get from the proliferation itself on some of these artifacts. Everflowing Chalice, a classic. It can be a 2 mana rock that generates 1 mana, and then eventually it'll be giving us 6, 10. Same with Astral Cornucopia, but this time we get to make mana of any color. Pentad Prism is another one that gets charge counters. We can remove them for free to add a mana of any color, but once we start proliferating, we can get this thing up to a ton and just leave 1 behind so it never goes down to 0. And all of these 3 I've mentioned so far notably can't be reanimated, otherwise they won't start with any charge counters. That's a bit of a bummer. But Empowered Auto Generator does make its own counters. It enters the battlefield tapped, but we have untappers. So we can either keep untapping this thing to put more charge counters and adding X mana, or just doing it the hard way and then proliferating, which is the easy way. And if we're talking about this much mana, I gotta bring up Elementalist's Palette. It's yet another 3 mana rock that taps for 1. There's a ton of these. You probably have room for 1 or 2, but this one gets charge counters from casting X spells. And then if we proliferate that, we can put tons of mana into future X spells. Now, before I get to X spells, I just want to mention Rite of Replication. Man, we will certainly be able to kick this and make 5 token copies of some of these bonkers spells. Just imagine this on a Deep Glow Skate. Bring a calculator. And of course, if we're making this much mana, we gotta talk about my favorite kind of card in the whole game, X spells. And this deck perfectly sets us up for one of my all-time favorite cards, Epiphany at the Drownyard. We care about having stuff in the graveyard, and we love X spells. This card is perfect for that. The thing is, we get to separate the cards into the 2 piles, then our opponent chooses. There's nothing that says we can't put most of the cards in 1 pile. It's win-win for us. Maybe we put 3 amazing cards in 1 pile and like 15 cards in the other pile. If our opponents send the 15 to the graveyard, great. We still have access to them. We love a full graveyard. And they've given us the most powerful 3. But then if they don't give us the most powerful 3, it's like we've drawn 15 cards. I know that sounds like a lot more work than just casting something like a Blue Sun Zenith and just drawing them straight up, but There's something fun to me about making your opponents go through that agony. Although not an X spell, Consuming Aberration gets X big, where X is the number of cards in your opponent's graveyards. But most importantly, it's that trigger that whenever we cast a spell, they keep milling until they hit more lands. And I would love to copy this. Now every spell's doing damage with Sphinx Bone Wand, or perhaps we're just doing mill at an exponential rate this way. I mean, if we're talking mill and we have a Consuming Aberration, I like to mize in a copy of Phoenix God of Deception. We tap one Consuming Aberration that's like 20/20 and we get to mill a significant chunk of someone's deck. And if we can do another one, now these aberrations are twice as big. And I think one of the perfect X spells for what we're doing is Hour of Eternity. I'm certain we'll be able to mill a lot faster than we'll be able to get things out of the graveyard, so we'll have plenty of juicy targets to target with this, and they all become token copies of the card, except they're a black zombie. Now, they won't be artifacts this way, so we won't get to copy all of them, but a lot of them are artifacts to begin with, so I'm happy to do it. Let's talk Mind Grind while we're talking mill. If you play with the same people a lot, you probably know how many lands they put into their decks on average. Some people won't stop talking about how many lands they like. And that just means you get to do a little bit of calculation and figure out how many you need X to be to get basically all their cards. Oh, and one last spell. It's a mill one. It's Maddening Cacophony. These cards have diminishing returns sometimes because once you've halved a library a couple of times, there's not a ton left. But that's where that milling 8 just becomes way more powerful. That might be more than half of what they have left. It's got all the hits. Huge splashy artifacts, counters being multiplied exponentially, X spells where X is over 50. I've never loved an Esper deck more. I had fun going on this journey, and if you had fun too, I'd really appreciate a like and a subscribe. Maybe a comment to help this get in front of the eyes of other Commander players. And if you're really inspired and you want to support the show so I can keep making walkthroughs like this one, the best way to do that is patreon.com/commandersbrew. But it's time to go, so I'll see you next time with a new brew. And in the meantime, you keep being you. The world's a better place for it. We'll see you next time. So if you're like me and you love X spells, might I recommend this deck about Magus Lucia Kane from the 40k Commander decks. I do love this Tawnos deck and I want to run this in real life, but this Lucia Kane deck has the craziest potential. It runs my other favorite card, Epic Experiment. You should check it out.